Okay.
Good morning, everybody. We are starting now our third presentation at this speech series. Bom dia para todo mundo. A gente está começando agora a nossa terceira palestra nesse ciclo internacional de palestras, cooperação, concorrência e conflito na esfera pública digital. Hoje o nosso tema é desinformação e regulação de plataformas digitais. Nós temos convidado especial hoje aqui, and now I'm going to switch to English. We have a journalist today, and his name is Stefan Myndiges. Stefan Myndiges is the coordinator of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. He previously worked as the general manager of the Institute of Journalism at TU Dortmund, Technical University Dortmund in Germany, and was one of the coordinators of the German-Austrian Digital Media Observatory. Stefan also worked for 12 years for the German public broadcaster ZDF, focusing on his reporting on digital policy, platform regulation, disinformation campaigns. Good morning for those who are here. For you, it's good afternoon, Stefan. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having me, and good morning to Brazil. It's nice change to talk to the Southern Hemisphere. So good to see you all. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about disinformation and platform regulation from a European perspective, a European approach. This is work I have been doing, an issue I've been working on for a couple of years now. I want to stress I am the coordinator of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. Nowadays, I started this job in January. All I present to you today is done as part of my academic research and academic work, which is not part of the EFCSN. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the EFCSN. I just wanted to make this clear from the start. So disinformation and platform regulation from a European perspective is a big thing in Europe at the moment, because we have been, or European institutions, European government bodies have been working quite intensely on regulation, on new rules, especially for big social media platforms and big digital platforms. And one part of this whole regulatory push is in terms of disinformation and countering disinformation. I want to go back in time a little bit to take you into to give you a sense of why this is important to people in Europe. So we had basically, I would say, three major events in almost a decade ago, starting a decade ago. So one is the Brexit referendum. You might have heard of the Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union in 2016. They had a referendum, and after this referendum, it became public knowledge that the people advocating for Brexit had been using manipulative tactics, that maybe even Russia had been involved. Same goes for the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Which was accompanied by all sorts of disinformation campaigns and misinformation circulating on big platforms. The large social networks played a very, I think, quite an important role in distributing his messages or messages concerning the elections. Though I want to stress that the academic literature on the effects of disinformation and misinformation on voting behavior is not definitive, and it's far from being proven that disinformation campaigns can actually tilt an election in one way or another. But nonetheless, for European policymakers and politicians, Brexit, Trump election in 2016 both played a big role, and probably even more important was the annexation of Crimea. And now we're all aware of the war of Russia against Ukraine, but this actually started a lot earlier with the annexation of Crimea, which is a peninsula, which is actually part of Ukraine, but was annexed by Russian or Russian-backed forces in 2016. And this annexation, which wasn't a full-scale war, and it wasn't an overt, like public, open, full-scale war, but it was that could have been actually called a special operation, so to say, where the forces that actually went to Crimea and forced the peninsula to become part of Russia weren't officially Russian forces. Putin once called these people, these soldiers turning up in Crimea, little green men, because they didn't have Russian flags on their uniform. They might speak Russian, but the Kremlin always went a great distance to always keep some form of plausible deniability to be able to claim that, okay, this was the will of the Russian of the Ukrainian people living in Crimea to become part of Russia, when it was actually a covert, semi-covert operation by the Russian state. And this annexation was actually accompanied by large-scale disinformation efforts by Russian authorities or by actors with close ties to the Russian state. And this was probably the most important action or event that really sensitized European policymakers and politicians and the European public, at least parts of the European public, when it comes to disinformation. So this is sort of the mindset that we're talking about. This is where this whole journey to counter disinformation on a European level actually started. And I know that this is quite a unique European perspective. I guess in Brazil you had a lot of other events which might have played out in similar ways or in similar sorts of fashion, but I'm speaking from a European perspective today, so this is why I only consider European events in this area. So, but what am I actually talking about when I'm talking about disinformation? In Europe, we are usually working with a very well-known definition which was presented by the so-called high-level group on fake news and online disinformation in 2018. That was a group that consisted of journalists, of academics, of civil society experts, and but mostly academics, that was convened by the European Commission to actually help give some advice to politicians and policymakers. And they came up with this definition, which says that disinformation includes all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So as you can see from this definition, it's not just false news, like what's usually called fake news. It's more than that. It's false, inaccurate, or misleading information. So what we see, for example, at the moment in terms of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is that a lot of old information is being took out of context, decontextualized, and put into this new conflict context. And so this is not actually false information, but it's often misleading information because it's decontextualized information. So this is first important point to keep in mind, that disinformation means a broad spectrum of content types, and it's the main differentiation between disinformation and misinformation is the intent, which is, I would point to the appropriate words when I'm speaking, but I look at my presentation in English, you see mine in Portuguese, and I have no idea what where I should point to in the Portuguese version. So I'm just not going to point anywhere in the presentation. I'm sorry, but my Portuguese is basically non-existent. Um, so back to the disinformation definition. The most important differentiation between disinformation and misinformation is intent. So disinformation is intentionally spread and promoted with an end goal. So usually it's to cause public harm, which could be anything from um, disturbing electoral processes, from spreading false health claims, to just poisoning public debate and deliberative democracy. Misinformation, on the other hand, is just false, inaccurate, or misleading information that might be spread without intent or accidentally. So this is one big difference. But I would argue that the term disinformation is nowadays often used as a placeholder for a whole bunch of phenomena. And I think that's actually a good thing, because we need some term to address a plethora of challenges to the information, which is not just the disinformation in the sense of the definition that I just presented to you, but also includes challenges such as misinformation, such as foreign interference campaigns. Think of Russian information campaigns, Russian troll factories operating in the US or in Europe. But it's also influence operation from, for example, domestic actors. Might be political parties operating troll factories or operating manipulation campaigns to influence public opinion covertly. So the way I use the term disinformation is in this more of a placeholder sense for all these other phenomena. Because what's important when thinking or talking about disinformation is to keep in mind that it's not just talking about content, it's also talking about actors and tactics. So what do I mean by that? Usually when we talk about disinformation, and there is like a piece of, like a post on Facebook, or a post circulating on WhatsApp, and it states a certain fact, and the fact is proven to be false, and then people follow this disinformation. But disinformation goes a lot further than that. For example, as I said, it's not just false information, it's false, inaccurate, misleading information, but it's also tactics and procedures to promote certain narratives or certain opinions. For example, the use of fake accounts to spread certain messages on digital platforms can be part of a disinformation campaign. Or where we see, for example, a very sophisticated Russian-originated disinformation campaign in Europe at the moment, where there is well-known media news websites are being copied and uploaded with pro-Russian content, the copies, of course. And then these links are spread through fake engagement and fake accounts on social networks. So all these tactics and behavioral aspects are also part of disinformation and should be considered disinformation. And this goes again far wider than just looking at pieces of content. So this is to sort of paint you a picture where people in Europe are coming from when they think about disinformation, why they want to counter it, what sort of led to this intent to counter disinformation, and what we actually mean by this. So it's more than just content, it's more than just true or false, it's also misleading, inaccurate information, and it's also tactics and procedures. Now, thinking about this very diverse and heterogeneous phenomenon and how to counter it is not easy. So I'm going to show you I'll talk a little bit about the approaches that the European Union came up with when they set out to counter disinformation. So first of all is strategic communication, which is basically countering any sorts of disinformation campaigns, of misinformation circulating online with your own communication offerings. This includes, for example, an EU-operated multilingual portal called EU versus Disinfo, which sole purpose is basically to correct Russian disinformation propaganda. This is, and it's important to stress, this is not a journalistic offering. This is not a news outlet, a journalistic news outlet. This is a strategic communication. One might even, if you come from a certain point of view, you might even call it European propaganda to counter Russian propaganda. So this is one aspect of the European Union strategy. The second one is funding. Mostly media literacy funding. So the EU provides funding sources to promote initiatives and projects for greater media and information literacy. They also provide, to a smaller extent, funding for news outlets and journalistic organizations. But of course, this is sort of a double-edged sword, because funding for news organizations from almost a government-like body like the European Union or the European Commission is problematic in terms of independence. And the third and probably most important pillar when it comes to countering disinformation is actually regulation. So there are a couple of legislative procedures and legislations, and I think the two most important when it comes to countering disinformation is one, the Digital Services Act, and the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is voluntary. Both regulations are actually aimed not at countering the content of disinformation, but the places where disinformation is most often spread. This is on platforms. So think Instagram, think TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn to a certain extent. These are sort of the big platforms in Europe. The list might be a bit different in Brazil, but this is where Europe is focused on. On YouTube, I shouldn't forget YouTube, since we're streaming on YouTube, I think. Hello to YouTube. So this is in very broad strokes the European approach to countering disinformation. Now, one fundamental tension I would like to point out is when regulating disinformation is, one, you have the intent, and the intent in Europe, at least as far as I know the European institutions, and I know some people working for the European institutions, their intent is to safeguard democracy and deliberative processes. So you have this actually good intent of safeguarding public discourse, but as we're talking about when you regulate disinformation, you necessarily need to regulate speech. And speech is actually protected by freedom of expression, which is a fundamental right and is one of the most important rights that we have. And freedom of expression does cover lies to a certain extent. In Germany, we have some libel laws. For example, if you tell a lie about a big company and this causes material damage to this company, for example, because their stock prices implodes, because you claim that they're bankrupt, this is something that's not covered by freedom of expression, but what you can get sued for. But other than that, like, you are free to claim that the world is actually being governed by reptiles living on the backside of the moon. That's obviously a lie and false, but you're free to say that, and you're free to claim this. So when regulating disinformation and countering disinformation through regulation, you always run into the danger of inhibiting freedom of expression. You run into the danger of potential overblocking, because you force platforms to take action on more pieces of content than they actually need to take action on, to delete more posts, for example, than they would actually need to delete. And you open maybe the door for potential abuses by governments and institutions. We have several or a couple of European Union member states that have, how do I phrase this politely, that have problematic problems with their democracy and with their democratic institutions. Because, like, for example, in Hungary, you have Viktor Orban, who promotes illiberal democracy, which is basically a light version of authoritarian rule. And when the European Union goes ahead and regulates speech, they inadvertently always give some, at least legitimacy, if not concrete legislative powers, but at least legitimacy to some member states, and open up these the European publics for potential abuses by these governments. So this is all to say that regulating disinformation, countering disinformation through regulation, and by doing so, regulating speech, is very difficult to assess balance. So how did the European Union try to balance these two objectives, keeping freedom of expression while fighting disinformation? So the Digital Services Act was sort of the big legislative answer to that. The DSA, I'm just going to use the abbreviation, Digital Services Act is abbreviated as DSA. It's a legislation enacted at regulating online platforms and digital services. And it's only in full force since February 2024. So it started to go into force early last year, and then it went through a couple of stages, and it's now in full force. And this act addresses various issues, including disinformation, but also online hate speech and illegal content. So it's a very broad piece of legislation, where I'm only going to look at the disinformation-related aspects. The most scrutiny of the DSA is for so-called VLOPs, which stands for Very Large Online Platforms, and VLOCs, which stands for Very Large Online Search Engines. The European Union loves acronyms, which is a horrible way of communicating, but these are two very well-known and famous acronyms by now in Europe. So that's why I'm sharing them with you. And VLOPs and VLOCs are defined as having at least 45 million monthly active users in the EU. And I put in the presentation, should have forwarded to my presentation here. VLOPs and VLOCs are defined as having at least 45 million monthly active users in the EU. I put in a link to the English original, but it's basically a list of, I think, around 20 to 30 big tech companies. And these include the big social networks, as I've already mentioned: Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. They all VLOPs and VLOCs, or VLOCs would be Google Search and Bing from Microsoft. And so these are being regulated by this Digital Services Act. And the interesting part of the DSA is actually that it gives policymakers and regulatory bodies a big stick. They can fine if platforms, big online platforms, are found to be in breach of the DSA, then can get fined up to 5% of global annual revenue. And when we talk about a big American technology company, their global annual revenue is in the hundreds of billions. So if you have a company and they have annual revenue of $300 billion, you can fine them up to now have to calculate the 15 billion US dollars. That's sort of one possible fine that you could find them. So it's a big stick, but I'm still not 100% sure that this stick is actually big enough, because when you have a big annual revenue and these companies have a big profit margin, so there might not be enough incentive for them to change any behaviors or be compliant with regulation um, when the fine is only 5% of global annual revenue. So this is sort of the conditions of the Digital Services Act, but how does it actually relate to disinformation, and how does it actually help in the fight against disinformation? A couple of points on this, and I'm being very broad, and if there are experts on the DSA among you, please bear with me, because I'm gonna simplify a few things and only paint in very broad strokes. So first obligation for very large online platforms is to act against illegal content. Well, this, for example, act against means usually deleting or blocking it. And what is illegal content? Well, this is defined by national law, the member states of the European Union. Again, this usually does not cover disinformation. It might cover some sort of libel law, which can be also part of disinformation campaigns, but it's basically not directly directed at disinformation. So more importantly, when it comes to countering disinformation through the DSA, are certain transparency obligations. For example, the DSA contains a quite interesting regime to give more data access to independent researchers, to open up ad libraries, or to make ad libraries accessible. They force big platforms to disclose quite a few data points, for example, on content removal, on user numbers per member state, per European member state, etc. So there's quite a the intent is to open up this black box that digital platforms usually are, because we're completely dependent on what they tell us about themselves. It's very hard from the outside to look into platforms and how they work. So the DSA tries to mitigate this a bit. And this might help in detecting disinformation campaigns, in detecting whether platforms do enough against mis and disinformation, or how they perform in comparison to one another. The third big aspect of the DSA is what's been coined a co-regulatory approach. So this is basically the attempt to balance the differences and the conflicts between fighting disinformation and freedom of expression. So first, platforms have to conduct so-called risk assessment, which also means that they have to look at themselves and sort of analyze, okay, could we endanger, or could people use our services to endanger public or disrupt public discourse? And these risk assessments then get reviewed by the European Commission and external researchers. And platforms have to prove that they take mitigation measures, so that they take measures to guard against these risks. For example, all big platforms, all big social networks have to prove to the European Union regulatory bodies that they do something against this misinformation. And one way to prove that you're doing something against this risk is to sign a code of conduct. A code of conduct is basically a co-regulatory instrument in which a lot of stakeholders from one industry come together with regulatory bodies and external experts, and they talk about like what would be a good code for us to which we adhere to mitigate a certain risk. So it's not a law where a lawmaker goes along and says like you have to do this, otherwise you get sanctioned, but it's more soft and deliberate instrument for regulation. And so far, there isn't a code of conduct under the DSA yet, but there probably will be one soon. And this is going to be most likely the so-called Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is up until now a voluntary code for various stakeholders. Among them are the big platforms, but also civil society organizations, fact checkers, etc. For example, the EFCSN is the signatory of the Code of Practice, but its main goal is to be to hold big platforms such as Google, Meta, Microsoft, TikTok, Twitter to account in their fight against disinformation. It was first published in 2018, so quite a while ago. It was updated and revised in 2022. And it now contains 44 very detailed commitments regarding several aspects which might be related to disinformation. So there is a chapter on scrutiny of ad placements. This is mainly directed at advertising networks. For example, think about the Google Ad Network, where advertisers can place their ads on any website on the web, dependent on where it is, what content it features, and it allows these websites to make money off this advertisements. And of course, nefarious actors might use these advertising networks to make money out of disinformation. So this is one part of the problem that this scrutiny of ad placement chapter is directed at. And there's a big chapter about political advertising. There's one about integrity of services. This is aimed at things like fake engagement, countering fake engagement, taking actions against classic or typical disinformation campaign tactics. There is a big chapter about empowering users, so giving users information, how a platform works, that sort of thing. It's about empowering the research community. This is maybe going to be obsolete considering the obligations under the Digital Services Act. And it's got some stuff about empowering the fact-checking community. So it forces basically big platforms to have a relationship with fact-checking organizations in Europe and to work with them to improve the content on their platforms. And then there's some more stuff regarding on the monitoring. And each commitment is broken down into very concrete measures, which are then again broken down into detailed reporting requirements. You see, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of digital platform regulation in Europe now. So it's very detailed code. I copied an example of what the code looks like into the presentation. So this is a short snippet from the code of practice, which is here. You can see the commitment, which is commitment 14, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important things in the code of practice, which is a commitment to limit so-called impermissible manipulative behavior. Think of creating, using fake accounts, bot-driven amplification, impersonation, deep fakes, fake engagement, all the good stuff. So this is basically what this commitment is about. Then this commitment is broken down into measures. So relevant signatories, which means basically platforms, will adopt, reinforce, and implement clear policies. So they have to have policies. And then there's a next measure that they have to report numbers on this, so that it makes it more transparent. All this is to say that the European does a lot of regulatory efforts, but it tries never to actually regulate content. So both the DSA and the code of practice are very, very limited in terms of, okay, this should be allowed, this should not be allowed on platforms or be published. It's very, very limited in order not to intervene or interfere with freedom of expression. The attempt by European regulators is always to go to tactics, to force basically platforms to enforce their own rules, because it's all good and well that the European platform, the European Union came up with this code of practice, and it says like, okay, you have to do something about fake accounts. But it was actually, if platforms took their own terms of service serious and would enforce them thoroughly, there wouldn't be a big fake account problem on digital platforms, because no big platforms can afford to allow these sorts of behaviors. They're just not enforcing it properly. So regulation in Europe goes to a very big extent, tries to force platforms to do actually the work of enforcing already existing rules. But since this code of practice is very detailed and very long and very extensive and comprehensive, it's also very hard to monitor. And we try to monitor it a bit, and you look at the so-called baseline report. So basically what platforms have to do is report on every commitment that's relevant to them and say what they're doing, report numbers, report data, if necessary. And we looked at the first set of reports, which were published in 2023. So last year we looked at the reports from the big platform, Google, Meta, Microsoft, TikTok, and Twitter. Sorry, I don't call it X. I'm an old man. I call it what it used to be called. And what we did in our assessment of these reports, we didn't actually look at whether what platforms reported they were doing was actually true. We only looked at whether what they reported were met, what they reported would meet the compliance standards in the code of practice. So it was a report centered, not an investigative approach. So we published our report in 2023 in September last year. And even though we had this very, very basic approach, I would even say, very approach that we only looked at the reports of the platforms, we still found, even though it would have been quite easy to get good grades in this study for the platforms, we found that there was tons of information was missing, data was missing or not being reported, and the overall quality of the overall quality of the reports by the platforms was fairly mediocre and was not meeting all the standards set out in the code of practice. So, and while we were looking at the reports by the signatories, by the big platforms, we even found that some stuff they did report, and in the terms of reporting, it met the standards of the code, but we had the sense that some of the stuff they were reporting was basically not true. So, for example, TikTok reported that they wouldn't have to comply with any commitments about political advertising because political advertising is not allowed on TikTok. But it turns out there is political advertising on TikTok. They just don't enforce their own rule of banning political advertising. So it's a very complicated, when you get into the nitty-gritty, very complicated, messy subject. But this also told us something about what we would need to look at in the future, because what we found was, again, relevance of qualitative responsive, so information platforms had to provide, was sometimes it was just public relations, blah, blah, and not relevant reporting. There was a lack of data, there was a transparency issue, and we found that there was a need for more investigations into whether platforms actually enforce what they say they're doing, or if they even do what they say they're doing. And this is sort of a big stepping point where we're at in the European Union and in the issue of regulating disinformation in Europe, is how to actually enforce these very delicate rules that the European regulators or European legislators came actually up with. So we can see that the regulatory approach by the EU tries to tackle disinformation while respecting freedom of expression. We can see that the self-regulatory approach, because the code of practice was actually voluntary and it's not working that great, this self-regulatory approach has not worked. So there's this turn to co-regulation, which I outlined regarding the Digital Services Act. But it's still very much unknown how to effectively enforce all these rules and how to monitor whether big platforms do enough, or first of all, do what they say they do, and whether these enforcements or policies they have in place are actually effective and useful to counter disinformation. So this is where we're at the moment in Europe. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's the regulatory authorities starting to hire a lot of people. So there's a lot of new jobs in media oversight in Europe at the moment. But I cannot tell you how this turns out. I cannot tell you if the approach of the European Union or European institutions is effective enough to actually successfully counter the threat of disinformation, the threat that disinformation poses to our shared information spaces. And that's it from my side. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm happy to hear how this relates to Brazil, because I was talking about Europe and the very European specific stuff. So I'm happy to hear what, if this is at all relevant to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this very detailed presentation. I think we could have an idea, a really concrete idea, how DSA works on the case of disinformation. And if I could sum up, I'm going to switch to Portuguese now. I found a couple of very interesting points. Primeiro, sobre a diferença, né, entre desinformação e misinformation, que é a desinformação, ela é intencional, né, seja qual for a intenção, pode ser lucro, pode ser político, manipulação política. O que eu também me pareceu bastante interessante é que desinformação é mais do que conteúdo, é sobre táticas e estratégias, e que a União Europeia tem evitado regulamentar conteúdos. A intenção é sempre focar em táticas, né? Me parece também que Stefan deixou claro que os relatórios que são cobrados, que o Digital Services Act cobra das grandes plataformas, muitas vezes tem se tornado um instrumento de puramente relações públicas e não necessariamente um instrumento de transparência. Esses foram os pontos principais que me chamaram a atenção na apresentação do Stefan. Now I'd like to introduce our discussant. Professor Thais de Mendonça Jorge. Professor Thais de Mendonça Jorge is currently professor at the Faculty of Communication at the University of Brasilia. As a journalist, she also has this background like you, Stefan. Thais worked for the most important media organizations in Brazil. In 2007, she held a PhD in communication. After that, a postdoctorate at the University of Beira Interior in Portugal and at the University of Navarra in Spain. Her research areas are journalism, journalism techniques, digital journalism, media in politics, media criticism, and disinformation. She's also a member and founder of the Brazilian Association of Journalism Researchers, the SBPJOR, and the Center for Study of Media and Politics, NEMP UNB. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Thais. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for your talk. It was very interesting for us.
Just a moment. Stefan, are you hearing Thais?
No.
No, unfortunately not.
Ok, I don't know. Precisamos.
And now? Okay. Yeah. So, Stefan, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting for us who study disinformation in Brazil. Well, as a journalist, I have many questions. The first one is about Elon Musk. In recent days, billionaire Elon Musk threatened to disregard Brazilian court decisions and reactivate profiles of blocked users in Brazil. Musk also attacked Federal Supreme Court Alexandre de Moraes, accusing him of censorship. In Europe, how would this case be handled? What actions could be taken in this case? É necessário traduzir para o português?
No.
No? What do you think about it? I don't know if you had the information about Elon Musk and that affair in Brazil, Stefan.
Yeah, I've heard about it, not in detail, but I mean, there's so much stuff about Elon Musk and so much stupid things he does. It's hard to keep track of. But what I can tell you with regards to Twitter or X is there is actually a process, like a regulatory process under the DSA that started sort of right away when the DSA went into force. Regulatory authorities started investigating whether X, or formerly Twitter, is in violation of the DSA. I'm pretty sure that they are. The problem now is to actually prove that they are in breach of the DSA and to what extent, and then there will be a fine. I'm pretty sure that at the end of the day, the company operating Twitter.com will be fined a significant amount of money. Question is whether this is in any way a deterrent for Elon Musk to keep on doing what he's doing. I don't think it actually is. It's sort of, he's exercising the freedom his enormous wealth buys him. And this is, I think, a situation in which, that's why or put it in a different way, that's why I asked the question, is the stick that the DSA has, like this 5%, sorry if you hear my kids in the background, they just go. That's why I posed the question whether the stick of 5% of annual revenue as a fine is big enough. And I think in the case of Elon Musk, it's not. So in this instance, I think the only real fine that would deter him from behaving the way he does is actually going to prison. But you cannot send anybody to prison based on the DSA. That's just, I don't know, maybe you come up with stricter laws in Brazil.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. When you say fact checkers in Europe, what are you referring to? Because here in Brazil, we have a couple of fact-checking agencies. When you say fact-checkers in Europe, what are they? Because my question is this. How does the fund for fact-checkers work? Who contributes to this fund?
Well, when I talk about fact checkers, it's a quite big group of organizations which are certified. This is important because basically what you could do, like everybody can go out and say they are fact checkers, but only professional journalistic organizations are actually certified fact checkers. So there are two big certification associations or certification solutions for fact checkers. One is the IFCN, the International Fact Checking Network. The other one is the EFCSN, European Fact Checking Standards Network, which I work. So what both organizations do is they organize a certification process for fact-checking organizations that have to apply to be certified. So you have to comply with a whole set of standards in the European Code of Standards. It's a very deliberative rule book which you are going to adhere to. You have to adhere to certain journalistic standards. You have to adhere to certain transparency obligations, and whether your organization meets these standards is being assessed by independent external assessors. So it's not, I don't review or certify any fact-checking organization. This is done by a very strict and deliberative process. So in this sense, this is sort of the prerequisite which I think we need when we talk about fact checkers, is that I only mean fact checkers that are certified organizations by either the EFCSN or by the IFCN. And I'm definitely certain that there are IFCN certified fact checkers in Brazil, because there's going to be a big fact checking conference in Rio de Janeiro next year, and it's hosted by one of them. So this is what I mean when I talk about fact checkers, and I didn't quite understand what you meant by the fund for this.
Yeah. Here only the fact-checking agencies are all private. They are not certified or something like that.
And maybe what she is referring to, please correct me, Thais, if I'm wrong, it's about the founding, because some of these fact-checkers are founded by the platforms. Is that right, Thais?
Not here.
In Brazil?
In Brazil?
In Brazil?
By the platform?
Is this the case?
No.
So
they aren't.
The case is that they are not they are not registered
official.
or
they're not official.
There is not a controlling instance, as you are telling about Europe.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's why we have these certification processes. And
okay.
I'm more familiar with the European fact-checking community, so I cannot speak to the situation in Brazil. But the IFCN certification is both the IFCN and the EFCSN certification both also cover terms for being transparent about funding and income sources. So this is actually one of the reasons why the European Code of Standards was written, why the EFCSN was founded, is because we have some particularities in Europe, particularities to media systems around Europe. We have a lot of small countries with individual languages, but very small media markets. So this is one reason why we wanted to convene all these organizations in one association. And the other is because we have some both regulatory issues, but also the terms of that, the standards should be as high as possible. And this was one reason why several fact-checking organizations in Europe came together and wrote the Code of Standards to keep quality high, to ensure bipartisanship and impartiality for fact-checking.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answers, Stefan. I'd like to ask if someone here would like have a question for Stefan. Could you please come? You can come there today. It should work.
Is it working now?
Are you hearing Stefan?
No? He doesn't hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Now I hear.
Okay, hi, my name is Laura. I'm one of the students here with Professor Lilian. My question is related to the terms of transparency and accountability that you have worked with the platforms, and how has it been possible to negotiate, to implement both the self-regulation that platforms have with the co-regulation, thinking in terms of the European Union, meaning that model of co-regulation, how has improved the terms and the conditions of transparency and accountability, and what are some of those conditions that maybe could be adapted in other countries in Latin America, where the regulation of platforms is just started to be in the public discussion?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for the question. Big question. Let me think how to tackle it. First, what made the way I interpret your question is what made platforms actually engage in this whole discussion about first self-regulation and then being forced into co-regulation. In my experience, it has never been the strategy, or very rarely the strategy been by platforms was to avoid regulation at all costs and just saying, they never went ahead and said, like, we don't want this, we're not talking to you at all. That's not how they work, and this is actually smart not to do it this way, because they go like, oh yeah, let's talk, and then you talk a lot and nothing happens, and then you talk some more, and then they go like, oh yeah, this is a very complicated, complex issue, and we got to talk a little bit more internally, and then they let some time pass. So basically what they do, they slow roll a lot of things. They slow roll regulation, and engaging in the self-regulatory process did in some way help them to do it. On the other hand, I would also like to stress that they do have some incentive for engaging in self-regulation, because they know that they have to do at least something to mitigate certain negative behavior on their platforms. For example, let's take a different example. Let's take hate speech. If a platform is full of hate speech and everybody insults everybody, it's not a pleasant place to spend your time online. So a platform like that isn't gonna keep their users for very long. So there is an incentive for platforms to do content moderation. And this also gave them an opening to engage in regulatory discussions, because they were doing something. And it's actually also a way to enshrine their positions, because the bigger a platform is, the more money it has, more you can invest in content moderation, and the safer the environment can be. This is, of course, always a balancing act. So you don't want to over moderate. You don't want to spend too much, like from a platform perspective. You don't want to spend too much money on this. So this was always a way, the sort of, at least the way I interpreted their incentives for engaging in self-regulatory processes and discussions. The reason why this has moved to co-regulation was because self-regulation was in part too slow, and in the other part it wasn't forceful enough. So you don't have any way to actually, if you take the example of Twitter, they decided, because the code of practice on disinformation was voluntary for a long time, they decided after Musk took over, okay, we're not going to be a signatory of the code of practice anymore. We're going to leave the code, and we're just going to not do what we committed to do. And this sort of abandonment of this code of practice would be totally inconsequential if it's voluntary. But now that it's probably not going to be voluntary much longer, it actually has some force behind it. And now, to speak to how this can be adopted by other countries. First of all, I want to stress that, again, when we're talking about regulating against disinformation, we're talking about regulating speech in some way or fashion, usually speech. And it's important that democratic societies work before they start regulating speech. Brazil has shown, I think, in several instances that the country has robust political institutions. At least that's my impression from afar. But there are other countries in the European neighborhood, for example, that adopted similar sounding legislation with the intent to stifle and to crack down on free speech. So this is the first factor I want to point to. The second factor is regarding transparency obligations that you pointed to. I think and this should actually be easy to do for platforms. The framework they have now, they're building now to disclose all sorts of data, all sorts of data rexes. This should be easily scalable to an international level. And I hope, because we're always talking about Europe, we're obviously talking about Europe, and we tend to forget about the rest of the world. But I hope that this framework they're coming up now, the work basically also the money they have to invest to comply with all these transparency obligations, that this is money well spent, so that they will be able to do the same or provide the same level of transparency to other parts of the world. At least that's my hope. But having said that, they won't do it by themselves, I'm afraid. So I guess but it shouldn't be that hard to take the transparency obligations from the regulation and apply them to other countries. Because it's basically just like, tell us how many users you got, tell us how many posts you took down because of this, and this. Like, these are very basic transparency obligations in the Transparency Center, the DSA Transparency Center. So this can be easily copied to other countries and applied to other countries, I'd say.
Thank you. And I had a second question that it was related to the fact that you pointed that the regulation was not focused on content, but on practices. And that's very important, especially here in the case of Brazil, with Elon Musk accusing that is censorship, that is a dictatorship of censorship. And in that sense, how can the regulation, or in general, the whole term of accountability and transparency for platforms can make it very clear that it's about the practices and not about the content, because it's usually used in this sense of propaganda, saying to all of us who are users, they're going to censor you if you speak of certain topics, if you or disagree with the government. But it's not about that. It's about certain practices that go beyond individuals. So how can that debate be taken or be clarified?
Well, I have to ask a question. The way I understood, and I'm not super familiar with the case, but the way I understood it was that Brazilian court ordered Twitter not to reactivate certain accounts, right? Is that?
No, I meant it more like, how can we make the focus about the practices, just as you mentioned, and not to deviate the debate that the regulation of platforms is meant to censor content, because here in Latin America, not just in Brazil, the debate is more taken into every type of regulation is censorship. So it's interpreted like any regulation wants to censor certain content, when the whole idea has to do with practices, with monopolies, with concentration in the digital sphere and all that. So my question is how to clarify that point when the context is very adverse and takes it into the other side of the coin, which is the content, not the practices.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to turn it around. Like we always, people like Elon Musk always tend to define freedom of expression, what we call in Germany, as a negative right. So a right that needs to be protected from interference, which is in part correct. But it's also a positive right in the sense that it needs to be, people need to be empowered to exercise that right. And if, for example, people are not empowered because they are being threatened by certain accounts, then this is actually impeding on their freedom of expression. So it's important to also always keep in mind that taking action against certain behaviors and certain actions and certain manipulation tactics is a way to actually empower freedom of expression and public debate. It's not about censorship. I think this is an important distinction that's always or oftentimes forgotten in these debates. And the second point I would argue is regarding focusing on content and regarding not focusing on content. It's in disinformation studies, there's oftentimes the term used of disinformation is harmful but lawful, which means like it's not against the law to lie, but it's still harmful. So you have to think about how can we mitigate these harms that can be done without interfering with freedom of expression or without establishing a ministry of truth. And this is like an important piece of this is holding platforms to account that they do what they promise to be doing according to their own rule book. And the second point is to empower counter speech or quality speech, I would even say, because counter speech is usually directed against certain narratives, but quality speech. That's, for example, the Reuters Institute did some great research on that. The best antidote against dis and misinformation is actually quality journalism. So if a media ecosystem is robust enough and lively and pluralistic enough to satisfy the information needs of the public, then there is less room for disinformation actors and misinformation to spread. And I think this is an important point, and I think this is actually one of the most difficult aspects because this cannot be fixed internally by regulation, because we cannot have governments fund journalistic outlets. That would be counterproductive. So this is sort of an issue that I think is important, but which I cannot really give you a solution how to do it.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Stefan, we have now a question from Lucio Melo. Lucio is asking, information is somehow associated with facts, but somehow associated also to truth. How can you address these relations, and how do you think those differences are related to disinformation?
I'm not sure that I totally understand like the scope of the question. As well, in Europe, we usually make the distinction between facts and opinion. So, for example, fact checkers under the European Code of Standards cannot fact check opinions, because if you, like, for example, give you a very basic example. I am 36 years old. That's a factual statement that can either be true or false, or correct or incorrect. But the statement, I'm a young man, that's up for debate. That's my personal opinion, which I hope you all agree with. So this is the basic distinction I would draw between facts and opinion. And sorry, now I lost my train of thought. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. The question is about the relation between facts, truth, and disinformation. Because the relation between facts and disinformation, we talked somehow about that, but truth and disinformation is more complicated, isn't it?
It is, in a sense that the point of disinformation is not to convince you of something that's not true. The point of disinformation is not to establish alternative truth or alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway once famously put it. The point of disinformation is to, as Steve Bannon once put it, the former advisor to Donald Trump, to flood the zone with shit, to pollute the information space in such a way that societies don't become polarized, but they can become paralyzed, so that they don't find ground to act on it. Because nothing can be sure to be true. Everything could be a lie, could be made up, could be exaggerated in some way or fashion. So force societies into this low trust state. So I wouldn't even say it's about truth, but it's about trust, that you can trust into something to be true. This is very almost philosophical, and I must say I'm a bit out of my depth because I'm not a philosopher. But I think this is the basic relation between truth and disinformation, to bring the third factor into it, to bring facts back into it. You can use correct facts in a disinformation campaign. That's why I stressed the point that disinformation is more than content. It's more than false, misleading, or inaccurate content. It's also about tactics and behavior. For example, if you like the fact that Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation, I think this year, is a correct fact. The fact that the elections weren't fair and open and free is a different issue, but just that he was re-elected is a fact. And you could promote these facts through fake engagement, through fake accounts, through bot networks, and just leave out some other facts that might paint a different picture. So in that sense, facts can be used in disinformation campaigns. And this is a way in which facts can also, of course, be used to mask the truth and not to unveil it. I hope this addressed the question. I'm still not totally sure I got what the entire scope is.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Do we still have questions here? Please. don't think it worked.
You hear me? First and foremost, I would like to thank you, Professor Stephen, for this amazing exposition. And it's such a delicate topic here in Brazil. The conflicts regarding Elon Musk and our Supreme Court are not from these days. And a year ago in May, we started to discuss the bill number 20 and 20 and 630. And at that time, the big techs such as Google and the Meta itself, they started to disseminate disinformation on such a regulation, saying that this would censor in a certain way internet, right? Which is, and of course, that the promotion of such disinformation from these big techs was overturned by Supreme Court, but it caused a stigma from with the society, especially because this kind of understanding of the regulation is promoted by a extreme organized group from the right wing that claims that this would censor or attack the freedom of speech. And this topic, this certain group, one of the things that they took promotion, and my question is going to this way, is that they took advantage from the zero rating, which is an initiative of providing free access to internet under the circumstances of accessing only the platform of the one that it is advertising. And you mentioned about the extra regulation, and we have two terms there because zero rating is promoting access to different kind of people in Brazil. It's a major country, continental. And these people that lives in the countryside, people, traditional communities, indigenous communities, are people that had not the resources that could in a certain way to communicate in a period of pandemic. But this extreme group, they took advantage of it and promoted disinformation, and studies shows that this was one of the causes of the problems regarding the COVID-19 that we had here in Brazil, and the spread of misinformation, disinformation, saying that the vaccine itself would be prejudicial, would be a problem, and cause lots of impacts to the health of these people. So we have these two sides of regarding the zero rating, for example, that we have a group that is taking advantage, and we have another one that for that matter can now communicate, can promote economy, can organize themselves, right? The groups that it wouldn't have this possibility because of the lack of resources and so on. So you said about extra regulation, that this could be a problem, and regarding that, my question is going to this way: what are the limits of the regulations in a country that is not digital sovereign, that it doesn't promote self-determination, self-management, infrastructures that can be built from the communities to promote their autonomy to create these connections and not depend on such platforms? Because if you regulate, then what would be the possibilities on a view that it is not promoting the infrastructure, the self-determination, and so on? But my question is going the way, what are the limits of regulations? Which are they, especially in Brazil, that is not digital sovereign, that it has not, that lacks infrastructure, that has lots of different communities with different views and claims?
Thank you for your question. It's a bit hard to answer. I mean, in a way, Europe isn't a digital sovereign because all the big platforms we're talking about are either from the US or from China. Like, it's either the US, everyone's from the US except for TikTok, which is from China, even though they say they're not. So the way I cannot really talk competently to the situation in Brazil because I know too little about your media system and the country itself. Unfortunately, I've never been. So I can talk a little bit about how the European Union does it, and I think in a way it's in a similar position because simply the size of the geographical area is similar, even though there might be some economic factors that vary. But basically what the European Union tries to do is to force platforms to adhere to regulation by imposing economic sanctions or not imposing but threatening economic sanctions if they don't adhere to rules. And which basically means that if a US American company would not like the rules that the European Union makes, they could, of course, at any time just shut down their services in Europe and prohibit like access from European IP addresses. Or actually, I'm not super sure how this would actually technically work, but apparently it is possible to shut down a platform and a digital service in parts of the world. And they could do this proactively, or at least that option has been discussed. It could be done by European authorities. And we know from many other countries that it is an option to turn off, to shut down certain platforms. But having said that, I think this is always the ultimately last step that should ever be taken, because that if you shut down an entire platform, say for example you shut down TikTok as a whole, that would definitely interfere with freedom of expression, because you would take away the platforms for millions of people to express themselves. And of course, in doing so, you would also take the platform away from the bad actors that spread misinformation and disinformation, sometimes, and other stuff like hate speech. But this is, I think, in these cases, the balance is off. Balance is totally off, and the interference with freedom of expression is too big. But it's like basically, it's a negotiation that you have to engage in with the platforms, because they are state-like actors. They have not state-like powers, but sort of they do. So you have to engage in negotiations. You have to pass some legislation that keeps them in check. And you always have to have this sort of last resort threat of shutting them down. But I guess it tell this to you in a different way. We did have like a very similar law, or in part similar law in Germany, called the Network Enforcement Act, long before the DSA. And that was kind of irrelevant to platforms, because Germany as itself isn't big enough and important enough to make platforms reconsider their behavior and their policies substantially. So it's a matter of convening and combining political power and geopolitical power to force platforms to act. I hope this answers the questions at least slightly. I'm sorry that I cannot talk more in depth about Brazil as in the case of the country itself.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you very much for this answer, Stefan. I'd just like to greet our colleagues that are watching us online, the colleagues from ABERJ, Brazilian Association of Journalism Education. Are you hearing me?
Now I can hear you again.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat. I'd just like to greet our colleagues that are watching us at YouTube now, the colleagues from ABERJ, Brazilian Association of Journalism Education, the colleagues from the Federal University of Tocantins, Federal University of Juiz de Fora. I'd also like to thank Professor Valmir Araújo for being here as our guest students from Nigeria and from Congo as well. So, I think we have only time for one short question. So, please.
Hello.
Are you hearing, Stefan?
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. It was really clarifying for us. I was quite interested when you mentioned DSA protocols and changes, especially. But since in Brazil we don't have any legislation about it, we see DSA as a benchmark to follow. So for us, what would you advise as a legislation so we can move forward on this approach of regulating big techs and not being so bureaucratic and keep a look on content and this kind of stuff? Thank you.
Ooh, I would say the DSA is a very comprehensive piece of legislation, and I don't know much about the political situation in Brazil, how the political parties can work with each other. At least in Europe, on a European level, there is quite a lot of, I wouldn't say goodwill, but there is always an intent to work together and to seek consensus. I guess that's why we don't see the DSA happening in the US, because their political system doesn't allow for this at the moment, or the political realities even more. So I would first consider this, whether it is actually a way political opening to have comprehensive legislation, and if not, look for an issue that's more where society is more in a consensus about, which might be protection of minors. Like have some way to legislate against the production and the distribution of images of child abuse, for example, this sort of thing, which is basically to reach a societal consensus is a lot easier than fighting disinformation. And this might be a way to get a first step into learning more or figuring out more how to legislate big tech and rein them in. And this is also a way to learn how to enforce the rule you legislate, because this is the big thing that Europe is facing at the moment. We have these very elaborate, and I think on paper, very well thought of rules. But it's a big challenge to actually turn them into practice and regulatory practice and to enforce them so that it's actually, because if you got legislation that you cannot enforce, I mean, you're you're doing yourself a disservice. So I would say look for something that you can reach societal consensus on and learn how to enforce properly, and maybe not be too ambitious to cover the whole space, but do one thing very well. So because I think this is also a way forward, I guess, for the if you want so global community to learn from legislation among across democratic societies and across democracies to see what works best and what works best in enforcement. So this is my very naive advice in this matter. I'm not a policy maker, but I'm just a journalist. But this will be my hunch.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So, well, we are running out of time, so I'd say we'd like to thank Stefan for your time, for this very, very interesting presentation and this very vibrant discussion. And we are going to see each other next week. And I'd also like to thank our colleague, Thais, for making our discussion more vibrant. So thank you very much, Stefan. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.